Hello, everyone, and welcome back to ChatJSB. I have to say, on one level, I feel really selfish making these episodes of ChatJSB because although ostensibly I do it for all of you out there who are enjoying the complete Bach and wanting to know more behind the scenes about the performers and the music, for me, it is just such a labor of love getting to talk to some old friends, but also getting to talk to people who I've not met before. Today is a great example of that. Jeremy Denk, who is one of my very favorite pianists. I would say Bach pianists, but he's famous for so much more than Bach, but we will contain ourselves here to Bach. He is one of the most intelligent, innately musical, and elegant players out there. And particularly with his recording of the Goldberg Variations, which I highly recommend to you, back in 2013, the whole world became aware of just what a genius he is. Speaking of genius, he was even recognized internationally as a genius, having been awarded one of those highly coveted MacArthur Genius Grants. And that genius goes far beyond just playing piano. He is a terrific writer about music and about his own life. Now, we are putting this out way in advance of the Bach birthday weekend in March of 2025 because you have some homework and we wanted to give you many months to do that. I think that you should read his memoir. I actually recommend that you listen to his recording of it so you can get his voice in your ears and also hear a bit of music as he talks about different pieces. So I highly recommend that. And then the other bit of homework, and you're going to hear this when we're talking in a moment, is to listen to his recording of the sixth partita. That will help you to understand our chat now. And in fact, maybe you just want to go away and listen to that, the first movement and the last in particular, and then listen to the chat. But also, I think you should steep yourself in that one piece before the concert in March. We're going to be a little bit out of the ordinary. I'm going to hand it over now so you can see me talking to Jeremy. But then at the end of this ChatJSB, I'm going to come back for a few minutes and give just a little bit of a chat about the partitas that might help you to contextualize the pieces if you would like that, if you want to stay on. It's like doing a survey after a phone call. So like I say, I feel really selfish because I just love these chats. I hope that you are enjoying just a couple musicians who love Bach, geeking out about Bach, though I do not put myself in the same category as Jeremy Denk, brains-wise or musician-wise. Let's check out that chat. And if you want to come back at the end, I will be here for you. Thank you so much. So as promised, here I am with one of the great pianists of our time. I won't say great Bach pianists because he's that certainly, but great pianists writ large. And it is such a pleasure, Jeremy, not just to have you with us today, but to be looking forward to your concert of all of the partitas in Worcester in March. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward very much.
Well, I'm going to do that thing that I suppose every author hates, which is to hear their own words read back to them. But one of the things that the audience members from ChatJSB know because they see me every time is I have a particular interest in the interaction between the traditionally taught musicians of our age that belong to that longer Eurocentric tradition and how that interacts with the HIP, the historically informed practice. Nobody could have been taught by greater European giants than you at Oberlin, at Indiana, and at Juilliard. And yet you did come to your own very, very distinctive style. And it's part of what I just admire so much about your playing. So I'm going to read something back to you that I think that you will recognize. And this is about Herbert Stesson, your professor at Juilliard. And you were preparing for your Alice Tully recital, your debut. And you say, in February and March, you listened to dozens of recordings of the E minor, the sixth partita, which we're going to talk about today. Schiff, Gould, Turek, every famous Bach person. I decided that many of those recordings were boring, and I had to fix the boring world. I wondered whether the last movement should be in eighth notes or crazy triplets. We'll come back to that later. Stesson encouraged me to be jazzier. He loved a wild Bach. He let me develop a vision and try to find all my possibilities. Over martinis, his favorite, after one lesson, he said, "You will find your way of playing Bach eventually, if not now." but I needed it now. That's not the way it works, he grunted. Well, you have developed your voice, and I'm just really curious, what was that road? What was that journey from those European-centric teachers to your very distinctive voice? So have at it.
I mean, first of all, it's nice to hear that little. I haven't thought about that little particular passage of the book and the Juilliard period of the book that much. So it's nice to hear. And that sounds definitely like Stesson. I think I captured him, his wry way of being, both wonderfully encouraging, but also at times a little bit like, well, I've been there and seen all of this already. Like everybody, we had to play Bach as a kid, right? In competitions or whatever. And then, of course, I fell under the spell of Glenn Gould, which you couldn't miss. And also, Ivo Pogorelic had this famous recording of the English suites, which was incredibly fast and motoric and fingery in a kind of astonishing way, a kind of a vision of pure digital, like energy. And I think both of those recordings were really big for me, and I saw something in Bach through them, right? The famous Goldbergs. I always preferred the earlier
I was
one.
going to say, you write about preferring you're quite dismissive of the later recording.
Well, for me, the later one is just preposterous. I don't get it at all. But many people love it and find it to be the most. And I don't want to ruin their pleasure. I just don't get it.
I agree with you, by the way. I'm not sure.
I never understood that, but anyway. So, and there was that, and then Shepard, who I studied with in Bloomington, he was a beautiful Bach player, very tasteful, very self-effacing, very pure. Some of the best performance. He used to play a lot of the French suites and recitals and things like that, and he had a way of manifesting Bach's language at the piano through choosing to do less, but also very subtle, expressive intentions that it's like, oh, that's amazing. I can hear how this music speaks through him too, which was in a way the opposite of Glenn Gould. Not romantic, but neither the kind of slightly mania or some perversity that sometimes you might feel Glenn Gould succumbs to. So I was excited about that, and I played a lot of Bach off and on, sometimes weirdly, sometimes more successfully. I played the E minor partita at my New York debut recital, and it was an ongoing journey.
Would you like to hear what Tomasini said about it?
I think what he said is accurate, and I said so in the book.
Yeah, you did.
A lot of ideas, too many ideas, basically.
Yeah, so I went back to the source
Right.
because I thought, and I've always thought Tomasini is actually quite insightful about Bach. But I love this. It says Mr. Denk's performance was elegant and imaginative. If anything, in trying to bring variety of touches, colors, and voicings to the music his playing was sometimes fussy, but his insights were always compelling. I think that's a great review, actually.
Yeah, no, for a 25-year-old kid, that felt pretty good. And Bach, then, the partitas became a big part of my life for the next 5 to 10 years, certainly. And I recorded several of them. And they became also kind of emotional obsession for me. When I started blogging, I wrote a huge series on the D major partita. And of course, I began to think about historically and performers bit by bit. At first, I was a little bit repulsed by some of the rhythmic tics of some of this interpretation. The continuous taking time around the downbeat drove me out of my mind, and still sometimes does. Sometimes the freedoms seemed to me incredibly liberating. Sometimes they seemed to me a little wayward and fussy. You lost, to my ear, some of the propulsive energy of Bach, which is so important to his style, the sense of the dance through this constant meandering around the beat. But gradually, I began listening more and more to these early music performances and harpsichord. Certainly in the last 10 years, I'm completely obsessed with the Netherlands Bach Society. They did an amazing set of videos. And I've spent a lot of time, especially, I must say, some with the harpsichordists, but mostly with the string bands, because I find that to be the most compelling way to inform my way of playing Bach at the piano, is this translation through the bow, and the sense of the bow as a meaningful way of thinking about articulation and how the gestures work, what the whole vocabulary of Bach is.
Yeah.
So that's a long answer to your question.
No, it's a great answer. And that's really funny because I wondered, and we will talk about two of the movements of the sixth. I have to say, and I didn't know if it was going to be insulting or not, because not all pianists want to hear this. I don't think I've ever heard a pianist capture the splash that a harpsichord can create in one of its sort of French flourishes. And when to hear you say that, yeah, you did end up listening to harpsichord. How have you tried to translate some of that color and flair into your playing? What do you think about?
That's an interesting question. That's really detailed. There is a wonderful crunch and a crackle to a harpsichord arpeggio or a trill, right? I often think, this is a slight diversion, but I often think Bach writes a trill or an ornament in order to create an accent, because you notice, or an emphasis of some kind, because a trill at the harpsichord is really an event, right? It's suddenly like like your teeth shake almost from it. And it sets out from the texture something that's really important. It's not just a elegant, polite thing, as we often tend to be taught to play trills in the world, especially of Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, right? And so I do love that element of the harpsichord. And there's a sort of demonic or fear. There's a fierceness to that crackle of the sound at times that is an incredibly important part of the Bach emotional language, right? And I don't like my Bach playing nor Mozart, to be honest, to sound too pretty all the time, right? So it's true, I do try, and that combines a little bit with the Hungarian things that Shepard used to talk about a lot, the knuckly. He had this real gift of kind of making you feel almost the bones of the hand when he was playing. Yeah, especially those kind of Hungarian ornaments, and I think that plays into it a little bit too, what I got from him about that. So that is
No, I'm just thinking. You sort of made my brain explode a little bit. I've played a lot of harpsichord continuo. I'm not I personally love the solo rep on piano, not on harpsichord. But I never thought about that. That the rattle of a trill on a harpsichord, it is an event, and on piano you can almost not duplicate that, can you?
I mean, you have to work at it. And we're often taught to play evenly and, prettily and, smooth out the edges a little bit at the piano. And of course, there's a place for this kind of smoothness and sense of line, of course, right? But the rattle of the harpsichord ornament is one of the things that makes the harpsichord recording so thrilling, and it plays so much into the way that the music uses ornaments. I mean, there's a famous, if I may say, just a quick example, one of my favorite, funniest Bach pieces is the D major toccata, which I often practice. I don't know why I have this special affection for this piece. People don't like that piece that much or love it as much as I think they ought to, because partly the whole last fugue is this slightly seemingly dopey, right? This kind of country dance. It's like country bumpkin dance almost. And then there's this marvelous place towards the end where he stops the action and then suddenly double time. And you can play that at the piano, but you have to imagine how mad that sounds at the harpsichord or at the organ, the sheer clatter of sound that it would create, the sense of, of course, there's always sirens in New York City. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, actually,
yeah.
Actually, can I veer you off a little bit to organ as well? Because there was something, I'm stunned, to be perfectly honest. I shouldn't fanboy, but I can't help it. That the toccata movement of that sixth partita, you So the beginning, which is all full of flair and very, despite the fact that toccata is an Italian word, it's very French. And in fact, that movement almost feels to me like a French overture. And you capture all of that flair that you get on harpsichord. But the build that you get through your fugue, which is almost overwhelming, um, reminds me of nothing more than organ. Then
Mhm.
almost like you're adding stops as this fugue is moving
Yeah.
on. Does that resonate at all with you?
Sure. I mean, harpsichordists do also, they can switch right to a keyboard with more with a doubling, right? It's more limited, I think, what they're able to and certainly that toccata, that great toccata, this kind of cathedral of sorrow that it represents. Um it has this inexorable feeling, right, as it keeps obsessing on its idea. And I try to use whatever at the piano within reason without beginning to feel too anachronistic or whatever, to capture and again translate that organ grandness and grandeur of conception to the modern instrument.
Yeah. But you don't apologize. And it's funny, you said something about there was that, because this happens to be my area of scholarly interest, those recordings in the 50s and 60s.
Mhm.
There was a moment and into the 70s when you almost felt like these great pianists were apologizing for having to play Bach on piano, but that's their instrument, so they're going to do it. And so they lean into the motoric evenness of it. What I love about people like you and Simona Dinnerstein, who's also a great friend of Music Worcester, is
Mhm.
you never apologize for the fact that you're playing the piano. It is intensely pianistic while bringing in the other influences. Does it feel correct to you?
Um, you know, to be honest, I steal from the harpsichord, I steal from the organ, I steal from all the instruments that Bach would have written for. Um, the things that I think I hear in them, the virtues and the possibilities that those instruments provide. I I admit I get a little impatient with this sort of like moral constant niggling about this question of which instrument is the correct or I don't know. There are a lot of people who feel very passionately about this, and I don't want to be critical of them, but for me, actually, the musicianship and phrasing you bring to the piece is far more important than the instrument that you play it on. Not totally more important. The instrument helps a lot and can do certain things, but I also feel that if you are in touch with Bach's notes and you're thinking about them in a deep way and what they might mean and how they're grouped, this can make up for a lot of the the issues of translation that come up playing this music on a different
Yeah.
instrument than it was written for.
Well, and it's the beauty of being at the stage in the cycle of HIP it's we've reached a detente. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, sure,
I
yeah,
don't. It's not what it was when we were younger.
yeah. Mhm.
I know that our viewers are going to be really interested to hear your perspective on how difficult is it emotionally and physically to play. I mean, these are profound works. These six partitas. What is that like in an evening for you? Have you done all of them often? All six together?
I did a tour of them many years ago. I did it once in Philadelphia, and it was my first time. It was very stressful, and I hadn't done it since then. And last spring, I did a whole bunch of them, including at the Wigmore Hall in London. And Bach loved these encyclopedic visions, right? I mean, before that, during COVID, I was doing the Well-Tempered Book One, which I think is one of the great evenings of music that you can possibly experience. One of the most emotionally rich and varied and kind of ridiculously full of inspiration nights of music that you can possibly play. I don't know where people get the idea that that book of Preludes and Fugues is cerebral. It's some of the most viscerally dramatic music ever written. Um, the partitas, of course, is like it's like apotheosis of the dance. So you're going over and over these dance forms in this way that feels like you're looking at all of human experience, yeah, through the lens of these rhythmically fascinating forms that Bach has transmuted. It is exhausting. It is a lot. I try to do. Sometimes I've failed at this, but I've never felt that the partitas require you to play every single repeat.
Oh,
Uh, I never particularly felt that they profited from every single repeat. Just like I don't play all the repeats in the Goldberg variations, because I think the Goldberg variations is such an amazing 65-minute piece and a slightly tedious 90-minute piece. Um, that's for me.
oh,
Uh,
that
uh,
is really freeing to hear that from somebody at your level, because I actually I
yeah, and I never felt, that. I mean, it is sometimes wonderful in the repeats to vary, and then and at the repeats where you vary, you can really something can really happen. And then, oh yes, there's a reason for the repeat. You're going through this stream of music, but you're going through it in a different way. And sometimes the shorter dances, of course, you want the repeat just to feel the nature of this the symmetry and the way the dance works, right? Otherwise, it feels a little too clippy. I don't know, but by trimming some repeats, that this what seems like a slightly daunting evening of music that becomes like similar to the Well-Tempered Book One, like a 2 hour and 15 minute journey through Bach's mind, through all these different keys and through the incredible extremes of from the pastoral and the charming and the funny to the deepest tragedy and the most profound joy that is possible.
and the thought, for many in our audience, this is, I've done a series called Bach 101 because we're all learning together about all of this. And
Right.
I particularly enjoy talking about suites because the dance forms are so important. Boy, will our ears be stretched. I think the partitas stretch the definition of some of these dances. I mean, I know some of them are marked tempo di gavotta.
You're
So
right. Yeah.
it's like a gavotte, but don't expect it to follow all the rules. Do you have that sense in playing that, these two Allemans are about as far apart as any two Allemans could be? Or is that a part of the partitas?
Of course, it's part of the part of the partitas is that we live so far away from these dances that we don't really know the context, right? We don't understand them the way that Bach understood them. And even in many cases, by the time some of these dances reached Bach, they'd gone through these incredible metamorphoses, right? Um, the Saraband is the most extraordinary example, right? Which started as a somewhat sexual up-tempo dance, probably in Latin America, and made it in a kind of like a fertility dance or some sort of thing.
No, I
And
did
then
not know
you didn't know that, yeah. And then it makes its way from the New World to the Old World, and there in France, it begins to kind of transmute itself into this incredibly stylized, And by the time we reach Bach, it becomes this dance that it's about a basically slow dance, right? With the snap of the dotted rhythm allowing for these incredible, profound statements, often of the deepest tragedy or deepest feeling, seems so far from where this dance, fairly simple, often guitar dance, began, right? Um, I do like this quality where a composer decides to test the limits of what a genre can be, right? The Saraband in the sixth partita is an unbelievable orgy of ornaments.
that.
And it begins with the dotted rhythm, with the little dissonances held in their pitches. But then it immediately begins these series of florid curly cues in which you keep coming back to the dotted rhythm as if for a refuge, but the kind of unfolding, the kind of mitosis or whatever of the small notes um, threatens to take you totally away from the structure and from the dance itself, right? And that tension that's one of the most difficult for me interpretively, to find the relationship between the structure and the identity of the dance and the free expression that he's after of the artist. Um, And that's what these dances often are. The Allemande of the fourth partita is one of the most famous examples of that. The Jig of the sixth partita, which is in the wrong meter. For
Let's talk about this.
Yeah.
Although I lost the. Oh yes, this was what the Stetson quote was about. Was that you were trying to figure out whether you do it in eighth notes or in triplets. And I would just encourage our viewers here to, of course, listen to Jeremy's terrific rendition, but listen and you'll find that some people do opt for triplets. So what was the way that you thought that through?
Actually, remind me, how do I play it in the recording? Do I play it
It's
duple,
Duples.
triplets?
Yeah.
Duple.
No,
Yeah.
duples. Oh, do you go back and forth in life?
I have done it now a few times. The first time duple and the second time triple.
Oh, wow.
Repeats.
What a terrific metaphor. That
As if to kind of explain the weirdness of it.
How do you
And
reconcile the fact that the duples just remove some of the jigginess of a jig?
Bach will seize on an element of a dance. Like one of the elements of the jig tends to be these wonderful leaping gestures, right? And so he kind of extrapolates from that and he creates this leaping fugue theme, with these diminished seventh chords. And if you squint really hard, you could say that has some jig DNA built into it. But
Yeah.
what we have now is a monster, is basically an abstruse fugue. What happens wonderfully is these little bum. He does like to do that. It's one of the great Bach tricks, is to start a slightly naked theme and then add some seemingly impossible running notes later that you have to find a way to fit in with the theme. So there's this marvelous later on this gesture, right? The dee da da ba 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 ba. Then what comes these little scurrying ideas, right? And I do have the feeling that it's like the beginning is a fugue and you're like, this is hopeless. But then the little notes are like the soul of the jig trying to break through the armor of the fugue, if you will. And I often tend to play it that way, but it's also lovely, da 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 da. And it has a slightly swingier Ella Fitzgerald feeling to it in that telling. At least for me, it's almost impossible not to hear a little or bebop or something in the way, because it does sound very shockingly jazzy when you play it in triplets. Not the way that Andras Schiff does it for whatever reason. He manages to he has an allergy to that, but for me, it's impossible not to hear that. And that's for me a marvelous part of Bach, is that sense of the naughty dissonance combining with the syncopation to make something that makes something swing.
Yeah. It's funny. I hope this doesn't sound perverse, but the first time I heard your recording, I thought, oh my God, that sounds like it could be one of the Shostakovich fugues because it's so angular. And I love that until the scurry. Yeah, there's Bach there. Oh, I can't wait to see what you're going to do in Worcester. People
It's a good question. Yeah,
we'll have to pay attention to that. I also did want to talk, just so that we can have people specifically go with intent to your recording. Can you talk a little bit about that opening toccata? It is just such a monumental movement.
Yeah, well, what's the genre that it belongs to? It's I mean, toccata is a strange term for it, although that certainly makes sense because it begins with the typical kind of improvisational passage. Although, to be honest, no, it kind of doesn't, because mostly the toccatas of Bach, the keyboard toccatas, right? They begin with a touching the keyboard set of scales, right? And they're mostly not that thematic, right? They set the key. Maybe at times they allude a little bit to themes that might come later, but mostly not, right? And then they only let the themes come out later. But in this case, he hits you right away with this arpeggio up to a dotted rhythm and the fundamental generating idea, which is a sigh, this sighing motive. And the various seventh chords that come along with that, seventh and ninth chords, actually, as it turns out. I'll never forget Leon Kirchner, the composer, singing that to me with this incredible look of pained sorrow on his face. And that seemed to me right? There's the incredible nobility of sorrow seems to be the two sort of strains in that. And then he visits the other kind of most cliched, most typical musical symbol of tragedy, which is the descending, the descending four notes, which you might use in any Baroque, lament, right?
But he transcends always.
What?
But he transcends the
Well,
cliche, the gesture.
I'm not saying it sounds cliche, but he's taking on the most fundamental types, tropes, as they like to say in academia. I hate that term, since I hate it so much, but that's what it is. It's a trope. It's a musical thing that everybody knows. This is what this means. And he alternates between this dotted rhythm, various arpeggiations modulating, and this other meditation on the falling idea, which is somewhat more patient, right? And that's the opening part. And that's the final part, right? He kind of bookends the whole piece. And then in the middle is this fugue based on the opening sigh motive. It's actually three sighs added together. Another one down there. Another one reverse. And then a little cadential formula. The way that fugue subject comes out of the sorrow of the opening, the way that the fugue wanders into these kind of blissful major key moments, these kind of glimpses of hope or redemption, right? And then returns back to the sighs and the grind of the dissonance over and over again, and it keeps building, keeps finding, right? And then wonderfully, right? I forget how far along in the fugue it is that the other idea, the descending four-note idea, makes an appearance, right? So he combines the two parts of the opening improvisation into one fugue. And when the second part arrives, that sets off your sense that this fugue is coming to an end and to a climax, right? It's an unerring dramatic instinct he has for that.
We'll have to do the math and see if that's at 0.618.
It could be near the golden section.
It could.
It's probably a little closer to 70% or 80% through, but it's somewhere around there. Yeah.
It's funny, as you were singing and talking, as a choral conductor myself, I realized it's a little bit akin to the opening Kyrie of the B minor mass, isn't it? The same sort of descending, da 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 dee bam bam bim the same gesture, yeah. But also the way that it just, you used the word inexorable before. It's just, there's an inexorable quality. And like I said, it sounds almost like an organ, the way that you bring the depth of, not just louder, but the depth of color, which is a technical, we won't go down that road, but that you have just, and this is what we know from your memoirs, you know, that you worked with these giants who helped you get a technique that could get those colors.
Well, I did have wonderful teachers, and thank you for the kind words. I do. You know, that fugue is one of the most powerful. The whole opening movement is really one of the most powerful Bach movements. It has kind of a universal sense of eloquence that so many people can relate to it who can't relate to Bach in many other ways, but that carries them.
I'm going to let you go because I'm sure that you have really exciting things waiting. Could I just finish with more of your words? Because I just
please,
absolutely love this. And it strikes me that it's the perfect way to end after hearing you talk about that movement. This is after you had played for George Shubik, the Goldbergs that you had been working on.
Sure.
You said, at last he offered one memorable universal suggestion. In the middle of streams of notes, he said, I had to settle myself. He'd make just one note last an iota longer and slightly sing it. Those notes poked out of the stream like friends waving from a passing train. His few words expressed one of the most essential tricks to playing Bach. Bach hates stopping and loves to elide.
Mhm.
His ongoingness is essential to his revelation, God's eternal plan, the spinning cosmos. But you must find repose. You must breathe while in motion, like the pilot of a plane turning in order to stay in place.
Mhm.
May I just say that as somebody who has conducted a great deal of Bach, like that almost brings tears to my eyes. It is so difficult to express the ephemeral evanescence of Bach. Poof, that does it. And you do that in your playing. So I just, on behalf of people who love Bach, I just want to say thank you, Jeremy.
Oh, it's very sweet. I'm glad to hear that passage. Sometimes in all that writing, I was like, oh yeah, that's worth writing down. It's not just navel gazing. And thank you. That passage, I think I summed up something about Bach that I do too.
he is hard to sum up. I
Yeah,
mean, a
he
man
is.
that contains multitudes. Like,
No, he does. He does.
um, thank you. We are really, and they have lots of homework. They've got to read and I think listen to you reading your book, and plus you play some excerpts, and they need to listen to at least the 6th partita. 5 months, everybody, to do your homework. Jeremy Denk, I look forward to seeing you in Worcester in March.
Me too. I look forward to seeing you. Thanks for the wonderful interview.
Okay, well, I hope that you enjoyed that as much as I did. He surely is fascinating and incredibly intelligent. I want to talk a little bit about the partitas. And I would, speaking of homework, and I'm so sorry to keep sending you back to things, but wanting you to understand so much about Bach's music. And that is the reason why I've been producing Bach 101. And I think that you really ought to go back and listen at least to the first episode about suites, because so much of Bach's music is steeped in those dance movements. And the partitas are suites. This is a little bit confusing in the keyboard repertoire in particular. We have the French suites and the English suites and the partitas, even though the word partita doesn't have the word suite in it. Sometimes they're referred to as the German suites. You might remember in Bach 101, I talk about part of Bach's genius is his ability to synthesize these 3 co-equal strands of Baroque music: the frilliness of the French, the singfulness of the Italian, but also the virtuosity of the Italian, and then the more sober counterpoint, for example, of the Germans. But because the partita is a distinctly German form, let me talk about that for a second, because there is something else misleading about the use of the word partita. The partita in the 17th century, so in the 1600s, the century of Bach's birth, as opposed to the century in which he lived in Leipzig, partita was something a little bit different. Now, as it suggests, it's something that is split into parts, one composition with many parts. It was essentially a theme and variations. And more often than not, it was for organ, because the theme was one of those Lutheran chorales. And Bach actually, very early in his career, when he was still a young organist, wrote a number of these variations. He would take a Lutheran chorale and then write variations on it. So, as so often happens in music, a term transmogrifies to mean something else, so that by the time that Bach in the 1730s was creating these partitas, the word partita had come to be more synonymous with suite. And you also have to remember, and we won't go down this rabbit hole, but so many of these names were not Bach's names for pieces. He did use partita, but things like French suite, Italian suite, he had not used those names for those collections of 6, because just like the cello suites, they tend to be collections of 6. He did say partita, but publishers often referred to them as the German partitas, and there's just no reason for that at all. But it does help us to think of that as the French, the Italian, and the German. I don't know how English gets in there. There's no such thing as an English suite, except that, as you may remember, I said his son, J.C. Bach, who went to England, brought those scores. So it's all, the nomenclature is on some level meaningless, and on another level certainly confusing. But to delve into the glories of the Bach partitas, the keyboard suites, there is an element of the original sense of partita, the original sense of theme and variation that does actually linger. And that is this: they are not a theme and variations, but the idea of contrast that is at the heart of what a variation does. One variation might be full of fireworks, the next might be slow and stately. The partitas are much more varied in their musical content than are the French or the English suites. Now, part of this has to do with the reason that he wrote the partitas. These were the first works that Bach published since those two very early cantatas, starting to pull things together with the complete Bach. If you came to our first concert this year, BWV 71, a town election council cantata from Mühlhausen, one of his very first jobs, that had been published. Nothing else was published until he had these published. He published them one at a time, these 6 partitas. Just a little inside baseball. We think that he might have been aiming to write a 7th as well, to make it a partner with a set of partitas that his predecessor in Leipzig, Johann Kuhnau, wrote, but only 6 of them are extant. So the set of 6 partitas, 6 suites, and possibly because he was publishing them and wanted to show the musical world what he could do, he goes much further in terms of, take for example, now we always talk about all cows smell gross, Allemande, Courant, Sarabande, and Gigue, that are always within these suites. Well, what we find in the partitas is that you will find an Allemande that is very different from one suite to another, as if to say, encyclopedically, because we talk about this with Bach all the time, right? Those 3 E's. His encyclopedic tendency. He wants to show everything that's possible in an Allemande, or a Courant, or a Sarabande, or a Gigue. So across the 6, you get tons of variation and contrast. That is reason alone, even though it makes it a big night of playing for Jeremy Denk, it's reason alone to hear them in one sitting, because you will get a sense of the very scope of that. Now, forgive me while I look at my notes, because I don't want to get this wrong. These works are the first in 4 books of a set that is called the Klavierübung. Klavier meaning keyboard, and Übung just means practice. So this is, and practice not as sitting down at the keyboard and practicing, but the practice, the art. It reminds me of Couperin, who wrote a book called L'art de toucher le clavecin, the art of touching, the art of playing the keyboard. It's a similar idea. It takes you all the way through everything that is possible. The first book is these suites, saying these dance forms are hugely important, which we already know, right? That's the first book, and he published that between 1726 and 31. He released each of them individually and then collected them later. The second book, the Italian concerto and the overture in the French style. So do you see? Book 1, German, book 2, Italian and French, showing everything that was possible in this universe of music. Skip to verse 4. Book 4, which is the Goldberg variations, which we know and love. And that is another kind of aspect of the musical universe for the keyboard is exploring these canons and everything that is possible through these variations. Book 3, I'm not going to talk about right now, but I will mention it in passing because it is the organ book. It is a book full of music for the liturgical year. We'll talk more about that when we talk about organ stuff. But otherwise, you see that this Klavierübung, this universe, this encyclopedia, because that's what we talk about with Bach, encyclopedia of keyboard music. And the partitas is his way of exploring the suites, all of these different dance forms in different keys, in different tonalities, the different forms, not just all cows smell gross, not just Alman Kurant Sarban Jig, but he goes further afield to explore even more. So if in that episode that I made for you, we looked at pieces like the bourrée and the passepied, the minuet, and the gavotte, which those appear more standard. But we've got a few here that you rarely see in Bach's suites. A toccata, you heard Jeremy and me talking about that opening movement of the sixth partita, which is toccata, same as l'art du toucher, the art of touching the keyboard. Toccata comes from tocar, to touch, and it is very tactile, and you'll get little snippets of a phrase before it completes itself. The capriccio, which is as playful as it sounds. The burlesca, which is another character piece, as is the scherzo, which we see much later, don't we, in the music of Beethoven in particular. And then the aria, and we see that word aria in the keyboard music from time to time, the opening of the Goldberg variations, for example. These different forms harken back more fully to the French suites. If you look through suites by Rameau or Couperin, there will be many of these sort of side forms, and they're full of character. Bach doesn't do that as often in these other suites. If you think about the cello suites in particular, they were very standard forms and didn't go all that far beyond the ones that I talk about in Bach 101. It's another way in which the partitas envelop much more of a musical universe. These pieces were really well received and really helped to establish Bach's larger reputation as a keyboard composer. Remember what I've said many times. In his lifetime, he was primarily known as an organist and as somebody who would go out and consult on building of organs. But these works allowed the larger musical community to understand what a great composer he was. In a sad twist of timing, this was the last gasp of the Baroque period. Had he developed this reputation 30 years earlier, who knows how differently his career might have gone. But the problem now is that we really are beginning to move towards the classical period. And by the end of his life, Bach was seen as old-fashioned. But certainly for this period, 1726, when the first of the partitas was published, into the 1730s, it really did burnish his career. I just want to look at this and make sure I don't leave anything out. So we talked about the diversity of style and the content of the movements. There's a big contrast between the French style and the Italian style, and he will even use the Italian word corrente for a movement in one of the partitas that he wants to be particularly Italianate, but then courante for one that he wants to say, this is me channeling French Baroque music. He really stretches the rules. So in that Bach 101, I taught you many things, like a gavotte does dum bum ba, 3 4 1. A sarban goes 1 2 3. But he stretches those rules in these partitas. And we know that he knew he was stretching those rules because for a couple of the movements, instead of saying menuetto, he says tempo di menuetto, which is, well, this is going to feel like a minuet, but it's going to break some rules. Or tempo di gavotta, the tempo of a gavotte. And I just really like that because Bach, his genius, if you can distill it, and I can't distill it as well as Jeremy Denk can, but one of the distillations is this. His particular genius was that he worked within the strictures. He worked within the rules. He colored within the lines, but proved just how much you can do within those lines. That's as opposed to somebody like Schoenberg who reinvents music with the 12-tone row. Who is the more genius artist? I don't know. Is it the one who can do everything within the rules or the one who breaks the mold? I think the answer to that probably depends on you and whether you are a mold breaker or a line colorer. And then finally, he really stretches the characters of the individual dances. It was part of why I wanted to talk to Jeremy about that final partita 6, that jig, which, remember I said that sounds a little bit more like Shostakovich and can be really quite rigid when what we know about jigs is they roll. He allows those rules to stand while stretching them as far as they can be stretched. That's the lesson of the partitas. They're extraordinarily sophisticated. As a third tier, on a good day, I'm a third tier keyboard player. Probably I'm a fourth tier keyboard player. I have to say, I can do the English and the French suites. The partitas, there is often one movement that is, if not totally unplayable, then it would at least take more practice than I'm ever capable of putting in. So it's worth hearing these pieces in the very able hands of a pianist like Jeremy Denk. So you've got 5 months to do your homework, and then come as an educated audience on Bach birthday weekend, that weekend around March 21st. I know you're going to fall in love with these pieces. So be sure to come to the concert at the very beginning of December with the Worcester Chamber Music Society, and then you get a bit of a break from Bach. But of course, we will be back. We've got 11 years of this. Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays.